I have a law student that I'm giving independent study credit, and she has an internship in our prosecutor's office, specifically working on trafficking cases. And by saying that that is her project, initially some of the prosecutors came to her and said, wow, I don't think I have any of these. And by her talking to them, and sometimes it's great to have it be a student, because you're not threatening to them. If I contact them and say, you are not doing your job, and let me tell you what you ought to be doing. Oh, who is that high-handed law professor? But a student, and we can all do it from a place of humility. I'm learning too. Maybe you can help me understand this law and how we could enforce it. We have these cases, and I believe that they fall under the rubric of trafficking. Can I help you figure out how we could put this case forward? So we saw from the statute, it tells you what those elements are. Sir, ma'am, I'm here to help you figure out how do we meet those elements. It's not going to be every case. The other thing we found with our prosecutors is we have to teach them how to go forward without the victim. And that's complicated after a trilogy of cases, Crawford, Davis, Giles, but it's absolutely possible. And fortunately for them, I have just published an article last May called Putting Forfeiture to Work, which is all about witness tampering and forfeiture and exactly what prosecutors ought to be doing in cases where a victim cannot or will not testify. We would never in a homicide case say, oh, I don't have a live victim to testify, sorry, that offender's gonna walk. No, we figure out circumstantial evidence, what else is there, statements to police, all kinds of other evidence. And we can help them make the case. So I think similar to where we were with domestic violence, and some prosecutors are still there, and sexual assault, we can help them get there with trafficking. And I think you're doing absolutely the right thing in framing it as prostitution. One of the things the Phoenix police have been willing to do with us just by having small meetings. Sometimes you don't want a large meeting. You just want a small meeting and strategizing who ought to be there. And we asked them that for teen prostitute and trafficking victims, would they be willing to just charge them with curfew violation instead of prostitution? I don't want that label, but I want to get them in the system. I want to figure out how can I get them services. And for juveniles, there are a lot of services that can kick in once they've been charged with anything. And certainly we know with prostitution and trafficking victims, they're going to need our help. There are huge numbers of issues. The other thing that we've started, oh, I can't believe I didn't get to talk about medical legal partnerships. You have got to do this, you have got to do this. Put medical legal partnerships into Google. The original one is out of Boston. And so what we do is, we've so far just one night a month, but we're expanding to other healthcare centers. We have pro bono lawyers and law students, and we run legal clinics with cases referred by the doctors. So the pediatrician sends us the kids who've been bitten by rats and the landlord won't get an exterminator. So what we're doing now is we're going to have the doctor start out sending a letter to that landlord or to the pimp or the, we want to start out with this message, the entire community is here to get involved in stopping what you're doing. So the initial letter might be from the doctor. Now we might decide in a child trafficking case, we're not going to mess around with a letter from the doctor. That may be more consumer protection, the Ford Motor Companies. I told them I was going to say their name out loud because they weren't willing to negotiate with us and we had to sue them in court. Don't you love being a lawyer? Yes, got that letter and they decided they would talk to me. He said, oh, I looked you up on the internet. Yes, I love it when they look us up. And then they're willing to talk. So that one didn't work, a letter from the doctor. But they figured out in Boston about 60% of the letters from doctors, a landlord was willing to then do exterminating or something like that. So you get the idea. But it doesn't have to be law students. You get pro bono lawyers, U-Haul legal department. I told them I was going to brag about them all over the country. Their entire legal department, in Phoenix it's 12 people, but they are now part of our team that got trained and they're part of our medical legal partnership. And for Maricopa Medical Center, they have put up a video cam and this one wonderful judge, so victims, trafficking victims, sexual assault, domestic violence, children who are too scared to go to the courthouse can stand in front of the little video cam, give their testimony, if the judge believes, issue a civil protective order for them. Or do you call it a restraining order here? Whatever you call it. So that would be a first step. But by having entities in the community that can help, and we could brainstorm, what are the 6 reasons that we can start out meeting with them and figuring out who in the law school, who in the community knows somebody in the prosecutor's office that might be more persuasive. Sometimes there are groups, different points when we were doing Court Watch, for example, which I started as a prosecutor, and I didn't always want to hear what people wanted to say, but they ought to be there. And you can go to watch.mn.org and get all the court watch forms, or I'm happy to send you all the ones we do. Fabulous way to encourage judges and prosecutors to follow and implement the law. Another way, just offering to help make the system a little better. Yes, sir.
Thank you. I enjoyed listening to you. My name is Naseem Kabiri, and I'm a graduate student from Afghanistan, a country where we are known for the worst cases of human rights abuses and women rights abuses. But it was also shocking to know the number of domestic violence in the U.S. For women killed in the U.S. on daily basis, and children, and many other cases of human trafficking as we were talking about. The causes of violence against women in my country are basically a lot different from yours. Probably a lot of it has to do with the poverty, lack of education, and wars, which are ongoing, the 3 decades of war, which is having its own negative consequences. But I guess usually let's talk about the domestic, domestic violence against women in the U.S. in the Western society. Most of the solutions which you are talking about, like, for example, how to make a 2-year kid able to, dial 911 and all other issues around that, or I guess most of it is dealing with the consequences, not the cause. And also, throughout your speech, you mentioned the issue of, in the first place, you referred back, or going back is, your family, the church, or, societal groups. But I think the society, your society, Western society, based on the notion of game theory and also individual freedom, is already disrupted and dismantled and also corrupted the notion of livelihood, and also the women empowerment itself has already, disrupted those sources of, calmness or the sources which you refer back to receive help. So how are you going to deal with the issue if the society as a whole is, facing this phenomenon and challenge?
Well, what's fascinating in getting involved in doing this work around the world, and the people that the UN High Commissioner pulled together in the year before, we all got together under the auspices of the State Department and the United Nations and Vital Voices. Oh my gosh, you want to go to a fabulous website, another one that will make you high, vitalvoices.org. Doing amazing, amazing work, bipartisan. But what we see is that throughout the world, there may be varying causes of violence against women. And what we want to do is certainly identify those, because it will help us in the prevention efforts. And you are correct, there is not enough time and energy put into prevention. That's part of what the Men Can campaign hopes to do. Because people like Dr. David Adams, who has run a batterers treatment program for 35 years in Boston, one of the things that he has taught us from his empirical studies is that he says between 95 and 97% of domestic violence offenders are not out of control. This is a planned pattern of coercive control. So we used to think they lost it. They had poor impulse control, they needed to go to anger management. I used to send batterers to anger management. And what we learned was that there wasn't any less domestic violence, that they feel entitled to be violent. So what's been fascinating in looking at gender-based violence around the world is that's the predominant theme. That in every single culture, other than in high up in the mountains in Chiapas, and there's another group in Indonesia, and I'm forgetting where the other one is, there is this sense of entitlement. And we as the entire community are complicitous. Where is our sense of outrage? How do we generate front page articles in our paper? How do we, and I know the Louisville paper got huge awards a few years ago for a series on family violence that a number of people said really helped get through some of your laws. So getting to your school of journalism, I guess you have one at UK, right? I'm sure you do. Getting to reporters, pulling them in, the ad agencies. I guess part of my message here is this has to be a multi-pronged effort. Absolutely prevention, intervention, and after, what do we do with the victims, right? That's been a piece that, for example, in this money from the Western Union settlement, no mention of the victims. So then I figure, well, this is part of my job. And this is where it helps to be a former prosecutor, that I can make that argument where they don't want to hear it from the shelter advocate. Say, oh yeah, they got that fish to fry. So we want to hear it from a law and order person, so that's good. So then we have law enforcement officers that we can bring in. You identify who are those people who in Afghan society, I have two colleagues, Afghani women who are doing this work. And one of the issues they were just emailing me yesterday was saying the government wants to take over the domestic violence shelters in Afghanistan, which we see in many countries. It's an issue here. In Miami, the city of Miami runs their one huge domestic violence shelter. So sometimes it works. Now, these are women who are very worried about the government taking it over because of some specific, as you're saying, cultural issues, and some of those come up for us here as well. So what's important, I think, is for wherever you are, you could be in Lexington and say, well, for one part of Lexington, this is going to be the right approach. For working with prosecutors, we have one approach. Maybe for working with immigrant, undocumented women, we need a different approach. And really being open to learning that, to just what you're pointing out, that we have to hear what are all the distinctions and differences, and how do we not get sidetracked by those who want to blame the victims. There's a book out, I'm not even going to say her name and give her any press, but anyway, she keeps arguing that, you know, the laws have gone too far and it's an invasion of privacy for the accused to be taken out of their home and have all of this out in public. It's like, oh my God, yeah, we haven't gone far enough, but that's another story. Yes?
Thank you for being so helpful. I wanted to ask you, and I do think I really like the focus on sort of economic constraints, or economic constraints a step back.
Mm-hmm.
And so I wanted to ask you more about the UN declaration around slavery and around trafficking, to see if you would say more about how slavery is defined, or how it's been legally useful to define slavery. You know, particularly given this idea, right, that economic coercion is hard to track down in a different kind of way than
Mm-hmm.
not to your head.
Mm-hmm. So the question is how we equate slavery and trafficking, and how we define slavery. In my opinion, it's however would be accepted and recognized to you or to the group that you are working with. And hopefully, I mean, there's some consensus. We can look at the 13th Amendment of the US Constitution, and there you get definitions of slavery. And I think the pretty accepted notions are being forced against your will. So the idea of coercion to engage in unpaid labor. And here we see huge overlap with sex and labor trafficking. It might start out as trafficked into clean houses. I know in Austin and Phoenix we have huge numbers of undocumented. And we could see how many people working at our university were getting a little nervous when we started asking about who they hire as their gardener, as their live-in housekeeper, as their nanny. We've seen this played out in the national media, people who wanted high offices, but they had wanted the cheapest employment and didn't want to give benefits to their person, and it comes back to haunt you when you don't treat people right, is my feeling. So I think there's some pretty accepted definitions of slavery. I guess I'm not sure what you're getting at.
Around coercion of forced labor.
Yes, and similar to the definition in even the Kentucky trafficking statute, which I think is a pretty typical one, a very similar language to what we have in Arizona. And that's why there's a fabulous book, just came out last year by Professor Evan Stark, called Coercion. And he really looks at coercion in intimate partner relationships, but part of what he argues is that that can be far more dangerous over time, mentally and physically, than even the punching and hitting. We tend to measure domestic violence, trafficking, those kinds of harms in terms of physical harm. Well, if the person wasn't raped, if there wasn't sex trafficking, not quite as bad. I'm delighted this Department of Labor under President Obama has been on the ball. They have 2 representatives that come to our trafficking task force meetings every month. We also have a fabulous U.S. attorney. Now that took some work. That took some people going to the U.S. attorney quietly and saying there are 10 reasons why the U.S. attorney's office ought to be involved. This is a federal crime. There is an international treaty. There are now many of them. We are also a signatory to OPCAT, the optional protocol on the Commission Against Torture. So, and again, we don't want to say there's torture in all domestic violence and trafficking cases, but a number of them, it meets the legal definition of what is widely accepted as torturous conduct in war, in many other contexts. So I think it's important for us not to use those words too lightly, slavery or torture or any of those, but to use them when it's relevant.